The book was open in her lap and her eyes were dry, which told Orville Doyle more about Lenora Lockhart than any introduction ever could have. Because a woman sitting alone on the porch of a house that every soul in Caldwell County knew had been empty for 6 months did not sit there for pleasure. She sat there because she had nowhere else left to go. Orville had been riding the long road from Hay City back toward his small ranch outside of Crestwood, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, when the late afternoon sun turned everything the color of hammered copper, and the cottonwood leaves shook along the creek like scattered coins. He almost rode past. He had water to haul and a fence post that had given up on its purpose 3 days ago, and a horse who deserved her supper before dark. He almost rode past, and then he did not, because the woman on the porch turned a page she had clearly not read, and he saw her hands trembling, just barely, the way a person's hands tremble when they are keeping something enormous inside themselves by sheer force of will. He pulled his roan mare, whose name was Tuesday for reasons he had never adequately explained to anyone, to a slow stop at the gate of what had been the Hargrove property. The gate was iron and it leaned. The fence that stretched from it in both directions sagged like a thing that had given up arguing. The house itself was 2 stories of clapboard that had once been white and was now the color of old bone, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and shutters that hung at angles that suggested they, too, had endured something terrible. The woman on the porch did not look up. Orville sat in his saddle for a moment, pulling the brim of his hat against the sun, considering. He was 31 years old and he had been considered, by various people in various towns, a man of good sense and reasonable caution. He had also, on numerous occasions, done things that contradicted both of those qualities. He dismounted. He tied Tuesday to the gatepost with a loose knot because he figured this would not take long. He walked up the path, which was flagstone half swallowed by crabgrass, and he stopped at the foot of the porch steps and he took his hat off, because his mother had raised him to take his hat off when he spoke to a woman, and he said, "Afternoon, ma'am. I don't mean to disturb you. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." The woman looked up then, and Orville Doyle, who had faced down a cattle stampede near Dodge City in 1874, and had once sat across a poker table from a man who he was fairly certain had already killed 2 people that week, felt something shift inside his chest like a tectonic plate, deciding to move after years of stillness. She was perhaps 26, with dark chestnut hair pinned up in a way that had started the day with more ambition than it currently displayed, several strands having made their escape and now lying softly against her neck and jaw. Her eyes were brown, the kind of brown that had amber in it when the light hit correctly, and they were currently regarding him with an expression that was equal parts wariness and a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. She wore a gray dress that had been pressed at some earlier point in time, practical boots, and she held the book. He could see now it was a collection of poems, Longfellow, the spine said, with both hands as though it might be the steadiest thing available to her at the moment. "I am quite all right," she said. Her voice was composed, deliberate, and he noticed she did not look away from him the way some women would. She looked straight at him, assessing. "Thank you for your concern. This is the Hargrove place," Orville said, not as an accusation, simply as a fact he was offering up to see what she would do with it. "I am aware of that. Walt Hargrove passed away in April. His wife went back east to her sisters in Ohio. House has been empty since May." "That is also accurate information," the woman said, and there was a ghost of something in her voice, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, the way a person sounds when they have decided to be faintly dry about a situation that is not at all funny. Orville nodded slowly. He looked at the house, with its empty windows like closed eyes, and then back at her. "You planning to stay here tonight, ma'am?" She lifted her chin just a fraction. Not defensively, he thought, more like a person gathering themselves before saying a difficult truth. "I'm not entirely certain where I am planning to stay tonight," she said, with a precision that told him she had been sitting on this porch working very hard at arriving at that honest answer. He put his hat back on. He looked down the road both ways, as though the road might offer an opinion. Then he looked back at her and said something that surprised even himself. "Would you like someone to stay? I mean to say, would it be a comfort to have company rather than sitting here alone? I have no bad intentions toward you, ma'am. My name is Orville Doyle. I have a small ranch about 4 miles east of here. I know the sheriff in Crestwood, Lester Hodge, personally, if that gives you any sense of my standing. I am not a dangerous man." She studied him for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods down by the creek and brought with it the smell of dry grass and the faint mineral scent of the nearby river. "My name is Lenora Lockhart," she said finally. "And yes, Mr. Doyle, I think company might be welcome, if you are willing to give it without demanding an explanation." "I have found," Orville said, walking up the porch steps and settling himself into the other chair, a Windsor chair with a split in the seat that he carefully avoided, "that explanations generally arrive in their own time whether you demand them or not." Lenora Lockhart looked at him for a moment more, and then she looked back at her book, and though she did not read it, she held it, and the tremble in her hands, Orville noticed, had gone still. They sat together on the porch of the empty house as the sun went down behind the flat Kansas horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and violet and deep rose. And the first stars came out one at a time like a careful someone was lighting candles on a very large table. And Orville Doyle discovered that there were worse places in the world to spend an evening than sitting beside a quiet woman who was holding a book of poems she did not read, in a chair with a split seat. On the porch of an empty house. After a while he said, "You eaten today, Miss Lockhart?" She considered the question longer than it warranted. "Breakfast," she said, "at the stage station in Hayes." "That was this morning." "Yes." He stood up and went to his saddlebag and came back with a piece of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a strip of dried beef, and a biscuit that was 2 days old but had survived in reasonable condition. He set these things on the porch railing in front of her without ceremony and sat back down. She looked at the food for a moment. Then she said, "You are a man who carries extra food. I am a man who has been hungry before and did not care for it." She took the biscuit first, and then the cheese, and ate with the quiet care of a person who is very hungry but was raised not to show it. He ate the dried beef. The night settled in around them, and the coyotes started their conversation somewhere out on the prairie, a long, mournful call-and response that was either loneliness or joy. He had never been able to decide which. "I came from St. Louis," she said, not looking at him after a while. She said it the way you drop a stone into a well, listening for the bottom. "Long way," he said. "I was a school teacher for 4 years." She paused. "My father passed away in July. He had a debt, a significant one. The men he owed it to came to settle the matter, and there was no settling it in any way that left me in St. Louis with a position or an address." She closed the book and set it on the railing. "I had a letter from a cousin in Wichita. I was going to Wichita, but the stage had a broken axle outside of Hayes, and they said it would be 2 days before the next one went south, and I had $4.30, and I thought perhaps I might walk and see the country since I had never seen this part of it." She looked at him then directly, without apology. "I walked further than I planned. I came upon this house. It looked as though no one would mind." "No one will mind," he said. He meant it, and then I sat down, she said, and I could not seem to get back up again. Orville Doyle thought about that. He thought about it for the better part of a minute, which was a long time in a conversation, but she seemed to understand that he was thinking and not floundering, because she waited without filling the space. "My mother used to say," he said finally, "that sometimes a body has walked as far as it can walk for the day and needs to sit in a spot it didn't plan on, and that's not weakness, that's just being human." Lenora Lockhart looked at him, and for a moment her composure moved like a curtain in a draft, and he saw behind it something young and frightened and very, very tired. Then the curtain settled back into place. "She sounds like a wise woman," Lenora said. "She was," he agreed. "Passed in '73. I am sorry. Thank you. He shifted in the chair, carefully avoiding the split. Miss Lockhart, I would like to suggest something, and I want you to know I am aware it might sound forward, and you are absolutely at liberty to refuse it. But there is a spare room in my ranch house that has a real bed in it and a proper door with a lock on it, and you are welcome to use it tonight, or for however long you need while you figure out your next step. There is no obligation attached to that offer. You would be a guest, same as if you were my sister or my neighbor's wife. I have a woman who comes in 3 mornings a week to help with cleaning and cooking, Mrs. Abelina Ruiz, and she is there tomorrow morning. She is a formidable woman, and I suspect her presence would satisfy any concern about propriety. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Why? She asked. It was a simple, direct question, and he respected it. Because you are a person who needed somewhere to sit, he said, and it happened to be the porch of an empty house rather than a proper home, and that seems like something worth correcting. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I will accept your offer, Mr. Doyle, thank you. He nodded. He stood and he offered her his hand to help her rise, and she took it, and her hand was smaller than his, and he could feel the fine tremor still in it that had nothing to do with cold. He let go of it as soon as she was standing. My horse can carry us both if you don't mind riding Double, he said. She's a good-tempered animal. I have ridden Double before, Lenora said, which told him more things about her that he filed away carefully. They rode through the dark Kansas evening with the stars blazing overhead and the prairie grass whispering, and Tuesday picking her way along the road with the confident authority of a horse who knew where home was. And Lenora Lockhart held onto the back of the saddle rather than around his waist, which he thought was exactly right for who she was. And the 4 miles went by in a quiet that was not awkward, but was, he thought, the most comfortable silence he had experienced in quite some time. The ranch house was modest but solid, built from timber and local stone, with a real chimney and glass windows, and a garden along the south side where Orville grew what practical vegetables he could manage, which currently amounted to a surviving stand of turnips and some onions that had made it through the summer. There was a barn with 3 horses besides Tuesday, a milk cow named Edna, and a reliable dog named Sergeant who came out of the barn to inspect Lenora with thorough professionalism, and then wagged his tail and returned to his duties. Orville showed her the spare room, which had a quilt his mother had made on the iron-framed bed, and a washstand with a proper pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture, where you could see the sunrise if you were awake for it. He brought her a lamp and told her where the outhouse was, and that there was a bar for the door on the inside if she wanted it. She stood in the middle of the small room and looked around it, and he stood in the doorway because he did not intend to come past it, and she said, quietly, "This is very kind. I am not accustomed to receiving this much kindness from a stranger." "I hope that changes," he said, and then he bid her good night and went to his own room, and lay awake for a while listening to the coyotes, and thinking about a pair of amber-brown eyes and hands that had trembled and then gone still. In the morning, Mrs. Abelina Ruiz arrived at 7 o'clock as she always did, and she was indeed a formidable woman of 52, with iron-gray hair and an opinion about everything. And when she found a woman guest at Orville's breakfast table, she gave him a look that he interpreted as simultaneous approval and warning. She made a breakfast of eggs and cornbread and coffee that was strong enough to have opinions of its own, and she sat down with them at the table without being asked, because that was her way. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Ruiz asked Lenora directly after she had poured the coffee. "Wichita," Lenora said. "I have a cousin there." "What does the cousin do?" "He runs a dry goods store." "Is he expecting you?" A pause. "I wrote him a letter from St. Louis. In July." "That's a maybe then," Mrs. Ruiz said, without cruelty. 4 months is a long time for a letter to hold a place. Orville watched Lenora absorb this reality, which he suspected she had already been aware of and had simply not said aloud. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, and he noticed her fingers were long and ink-stained at the tips, a schoolteacher's hands. "I am a qualified teacher," Lenora said. I taught primary grades in St. Louis for 4 years. I have my teaching certificate. I kept it. She paused. I kept very little else, but I kept that. Mrs. Ruiz looked at her steadily. There are children in this county who have no school and no teacher since the one they had left in the spring to marry a man in Colorado. The school board has been trying to find someone since June. She looked at Orville. Am I correct? You are correct, Orville said, wrapping his hands around his own cup, keeping his face carefully neutral because he did not want to be seen steering anything. The schoolhouse is in Crestwood, Mrs. Ruiz continued. About 2 miles from here, 3 miles from the Hargrove place where I am told you were sitting last evening. She fixed Lenora with a look that was not unkind. A teaching position would give you a wage and a reason to be here and time to decide what comes next. If your cousin in Wichita is expecting you, Wichita will still be there in a season. Lenora set her coffee cup down and looked at it. Something moved across her face, a series of calculations and a deep weariness, and then something else, something that might have been the first thin edge of a door opening. Who would I speak to, she asked. About the position. Gerald Fitch is the head of the school board, Orville said. He is also the man who owns the feed store on Main Street in Crestwood. He is not particularly complicated. If you show him your certificate and tell him what grades you can teach, he will hire you the same day. Lenora looked at Orville and then at Mrs. Ruiz and then at her coffee cup. I would need somewhere to stay, she said. The schoolteacher before you lived in the Bauer house, Mrs. Ruiz said. Ada Bauer is a widow who takes in a boarder sometimes. She is quiet and she keeps a clean house and she charges a fair rate. There was a silence, and then Lenora said, in a voice that was so carefully controlled it was almost colorless, it seems as though this has been thought about. Mrs. Ruiz shrugged, which was itself a kind of eloquence. I notice things, she said. I notice them quickly. Orville said nothing. He ate his cornbread. He looked out the window at his turnips. Lenora took a breath. It was a long breath, and it seemed to carry something out of her when she released it. Then I would be grateful, she said, for an introduction to Mr. Fitch. That afternoon, Orville drove Lenora into Crestwood in his wagon, because she still had her carpetbag from the night before, and Mrs. Ruiz had pressed an additional half-dozen corn muffins and a jar of apple preserves on her as if equipping an expedition, which in a way it was. Crestwood in the autumn of 1878 was a town of perhaps 300 souls, with a main street of packed dirt and plank sidewalks, a hotel called the Meridian, 2 saloons, a barber, a general store, a church, the feed store, a land office, and a small whitewashed building that served as both the sheriff's office and the jail. The schoolhouse was on the south side of town, a single-room building with a bell above the door, and a yard ringed with a wooden fence. Orville introduced Lenora to Gerald Fitch, who was a red-faced man of 50 with a bristling white mustache and the straightforward manner of a man who has priced feed for a living and has no time for ambiguity. He looked at Lenora's teaching certificate with the serious attention you gave a bill of sale, asked her 3 direct questions about classroom management, and shook her hand with the solemnity of a transaction completed. School starts Monday, he said. 14 children, ages 6 to 13. The primer books are in the back cupboard and the globe is cracked but still usable. Ada Bauer's place is on Elm Street, blue shutters, you cannot miss it. She will expect payment the 1st of each month. I suggest you be firm about order in the classroom. Children here have a tendency to test a new teacher. Lenora said, I have found that consistency and genuine interest in a child's progress are more effective than severity, Mr. Fitch. Fitch looked at her for a moment. Well, he said. That may be so. The job is yours, Miss Lockhart. Orville drove her to Ada Bauer's afterward, and Ada Bauer was a small, precise woman of 60 who wore her white hair braided and coiled, and her house was indeed clean and quiet. She showed Lenora the room on the 2nd floor with its view of the elm tree on the street, and the rate was $2 a month, which Lenora could manage once she received her first wage from the school board. Orville quietly arranged with Ada Bauer, without mentioning it to Lenora, that the first month's payment would be settled. When Lenora came downstairs from viewing the room, she looked at him and said, "You have done something." "I don't know what you mean," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Doyle," she said, not unkindly, "I told you I was a schoolteacher. Schoolteachers observe children for years. They become quite good at reading people." He put on his hat. "The room suits you?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "It does." "Thank you, Orville." She used his given name for the first time, and it came out without apparent deliberation, as natural as breath, and it did something to the interior of his chest that he was not prepared for. "You are welcome, Lenora," he said, because what else could he do? And the name fit in his mouth like something that had been there before and was only now coming home. He drove back to his ranch alone in the autumn evening, and Sargent came out to greet him, and Edna the cow needed milking, and the fence post still needed attention. And all of these things were true and present and real. And underneath all of them, quiet and insistent as a river, was the thought of amber-brown eyes and ink-stained fingers, and a woman who had held a book she was not reading on the porch of an empty house while her hands trembled and the world around her had come to its difficult end, and she had kept herself together through it by will alone. He fixed the fence post. He milked Edna. He fed the horses. He sat on his own porch that evening with a cup of coffee and looked out at the stars and thought that 4 miles was a very short distance and also, depending on the circumstances, a very long way. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that he had not expected. Monday through Friday, Lenora taught school in Crestwood. She was good at it. He heard this from Mrs. Ruiz, who had a granddaughter named Paz among the 14 students, and who reported with satisfaction that Miss Lockhart had in 1 week established order in the classroom, not through severity, but through the quality of her attention, which she gave to each child as though they were the most interesting person she had spoken to that day. On Friday afternoons, she walked the 2 miles from the schoolhouse to his ranch, because he had mentioned there was a library of sorts in his sitting room, 3 shelves of books, left to him by his mother and supplemented over the years, and she had looked at him with the expression of someone who has been told there is water available when they are very thirsty. He was always home on Friday afternoons. This was not a coincidence. She would come in and greet Sargent, who had from the second visit decided she was specifically his responsibility, and she would look at the bookshelves with the same focused, deliberate pleasure she might look at a landscape. And she would select something, and they would sit in the sitting room with coffee, and she would read, and sometimes he would read the stock almanac or work at mending harness, and the afternoon would pass in that extraordinary comfortable quiet that he had not known since his mother was alive. But it was not always quiet. Sometimes she would read something aloud to him, a passage of Whitman or a chapter from Dickens, and her voice doing that work was something he stored away like a man stores firewood, against future cold. Sometimes she would ask him about the ranch, about the history of the land, about the cattle business, and she asked with genuine curiosity, not politeness, and he found himself talking more than he typically did, because she listened the way she read, with her whole attention. He learned about her in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by traveling through it rather than looking at a map. He learned that her mother had died when Lenora was 12, and that her father, James Lockhart, had been a charming and brilliant man and a reckless one, who had borrowed money with the confidence of someone who did not quite believe the future was real. He learned that she had been close to him despite all this, that she had read to him on evenings when his health was poor, that losing him had been a grief complicated by anger that she was still working her way through. He learned that she could bake bread that was noticeably better than his own attempts, that she had a precise and unsentimental sense of humor that emerged when she was comfortable, that she had once, at the age of 19, wanted to go to college, which women could do in some states, and that the money for it had not materialized, and she had redirected that ambition into her teaching and had not, she said, regretted the redirect, only the circumstances that necessitated it. He told her about his own history, with comparable economy. Born in Indiana in 1847, came west with his family in 1860. His father's land ambitions in Kansas had worked out better than most. He had spent time on cattle drives in his 20s, done the Kishom Trail twice, bought the ranch in 1874 with money he had earned, and a loan from the Crestwood Bank that he had spent 3 subsequent years paying back with the methodical determination that was his primary character trait. He had not, he said, married, because the trail life did not suit a marriage, and the years after had been given to building the ranch into something real. And he had not met anyone who made him want to stop building things for his own sake and start building them for someone else's. He said this last part on the 6th Friday she visited in November, when the light was going early, and the sitting room had a fire in the wood stove, and Sargent had placed his head on Lenora's foot with the calm presumption of ownership. And she had looked up from the Dickens she was reading and caught him looking at her, and he had said it without planning to. And then the fire crackled and the wind pushed against the window glass, and she looked at him steadily for a long moment. "Is that still true?" she asked. Quietly, less so than it was, he said, also quietly. She looked back at her book. But she did not read it for a while, and the color in her cheeks was not entirely attributable to the fire. He did not press her. He was a patient man, built for patience the way some men are built for speed, and he thought he understood that she had arrived here carrying something very heavy, and that she was only now beginning to set it down, and that a woman in that process needed room rather than urgency. He found other excuses to be useful without being obtrusive. When the school board's promised supply of chalk was late, he drove to Hayes City himself and bought chalk and brought it to the schoolhouse. When one of Ada Bower's porch steps rotted through and Ada mentioned it at the general store, Orville happened to be there, and the next morning the step was repaired. Lenora knew he had done these things. She said nothing directly about them, but she looked at him on Friday afternoons with something in her expression that was deepening, like a river getting deeper as it goes further from its source. In December the first snow came and the prairie went white and silent and vast. And on the Friday that followed the first big snowfall, Lenora did not walk to the ranch because the road was not walkable, and Orville sat in his sitting room with his books and his coffee, and discovered that Friday without her, in it, had a quality like a room from which a lamp has been removed, technically inhabitable, but dimmer, and you kept reaching for a light that was not there. He rode to Crestwood the next morning on Tuesday in the cold, and stopped at Ada Bower's. And when Lenora came to the door he said, "I came to see if you were all right in the snow." She was wearing a dark blue wool dress he had not seen before, Ada Bower's, probably lent for warmth, and her hair was loose around her shoulders because it was morning and she had not put it up yet. And she looked at him standing on the step in the cold with snow on his hat brim, and she laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the first full one he had heard from her. And it was like hearing a bell that you had been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. "I am perfectly all right in the snow," she said. "You rode 4 miles in the cold to ask me that." "The road seemed less than 4 miles today," he said honestly. She stepped back from the door. "Come in then, Orville, before you freeze. Ada has coffee on." He came in. Ada Bower gave him coffee with the neutral expression of a woman who has decided to observe something without commenting on it. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table, and Ada talked about a letter she had received from her daughter in Topeka, and Lenora told them about the children's reaction to the first snow, which had produced a degree of excitement in the classroom that had required her to take the entire class outside for 20 minutes to throw snowballs before any learning could proceed. Orville laughed at this, and she looked at him while he was laughing, and he saw in her face the same quality he thought was probably in his own, the look of someone who is beginning to believe, cautiously, in good things. He stayed 2 hours. He rode home in the cold with Tuesday's breath making small clouds in the air and the snow squeaking under her hooves and the flat white Kansas sky above them both, and he was not cold at all for the entire journey. In January, the school board received a complaint. It came from a man named Harlan Dutton, who ran cattle on 300 acres west of Crestwood and who had 2 sons in the school, ages 8 and 11. The complaint was that Miss Lockhart had been teaching from materials he found objectionable specifically. She had been reading to the children from a book of essays that included one by a man whose views on the education of working people Dutt found dangerously progressive. And more broadly, that he was not certain a woman from the city, without local roots, had the proper understanding of what Crestwood children needed to know. Gerald Fitch came to Lenora with the complaint, and she received it with a composure that Orville, who heard about the meeting second-hand from Mrs. Ruiz, suspected cost her more than it appeared. She came to the ranch that Friday, and for the first time she arrived without the book she typically carried, and Sargent put his head on her foot as usual, but she did not pet him for several minutes, which told Orville immediately that something was seriously wrong. He put coffee on without asking. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and he said nothing, because he knew that with Lenora the thing needed to find its own way out. "Harlan Dutton believes I am teaching subversive ideas," she said at length, "because I read the children an essay about the value of education for all people." She said this with a careful flatness. "He has suggested to Gerald Fitch that my contract perhaps should not be renewed for the spring term. Does Fitch agree with him?" "Gerald Fitch," she said, "is a man who is primarily motivated by avoiding controversy, which in this case means he is taking no clear position, which is effectively a position." Orville turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Dutton is a loud man," he said. "He is not a particularly respected one. He has complained about the previous 2 teachers as well." "Has he been effective before?" Orville considered telling a partial truth and then didn't. "The teacher before last left partly because of him," he said. "But that teacher was also young and had other reasons for leaving." Lenora was quiet. Her hands were flat on the table still, and he could see her working something through. Then she said, in a voice that was very controlled but had something bright and steely underneath it, "I did nothing wrong, Orville. I did not teach anything harmful or false. I taught children that learning is valuable. I gave them an essay that said working people deserve the same quality of education as wealthy ones. That is what I believe, and it is what the evidence of my own life has confirmed, and I will not apologize for it or pretend it was a mistake." "I don't think you should," he said. She looked at him. "But I may lose the position." "You may," he said honestly, "but I do not think Dutton speaks for the whole school board. There are 4 members. Fitch is cautious. Ed Carmichael runs the hotel and he has 2 daughters in your school who he talks about constantly. Ruth Farber's husband is on the board and she has made no secret of what she thinks of Dutton generally." He paused. "If you wanted to make the case directly to the board rather than through Fitch, you have a right to do that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Would you come with me, if you want me there?" "I want you there," she said, and the simplicity and directness of it, without any apologetic qualifications, landed on him like sunlight. The school board met on the last Tuesday of January in the back room of the Meridian Hotel. It was cold, and the room smelled of lamp oil and old cigar smoke, and the 4 board members, Fitch, Ed Carmichael, Tom Farber, and a man named Cobb who ran the land office sat at a table, and Harlan Dutton sat in a chair against the wall with his arms folded, and the expression of a man who has decided he is important. And Lenora Lockhart stood before the table with her hands at her sides, and her teaching certificate in one hand and her back as straight as a fence post. And Orville Doyle sat in the second row of the small assembled audience, because she had wanted him there and he was there. She spoke for 12 minutes. She described what she had taught and why. She described each of the 14 children in the class by name and gave a specific account of each child's progress since September. She explained the essay in question and read 2 paragraphs of it aloud. She spoke without notes and without apparent nervousness, in the voice she used when she was most certain of herself, the one that was quiet and clear as water over stone. When she finished, Ed Carmichael said, "My daughters come home on Fridays talking about things they have learned, Miss Lockhart." Last week my younger one told me about the life cycle of rivers. I did not know what the life cycle of a river was until my 8-year-old daughter explained it to me over supper. There was a small ripple of laughter in the room. Tom Farber said, "I have no complaint." Cobb said, "I have no complaint either." Fitch said, "The contract will continue." Harlan Dutton unfolded his arms and folded them again and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Outside in the cold, Lenora put her coat on and turned to Orville, and the relief that she had been keeping very carefully out of the room came across her face in a slow, warm wave. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't say a word in there," he said. "No," she agreed, "but you were there." They walked back down the main street of Crestwood in the January cold, with their breath making clouds, and without any discussion they went in the direction of the ranch rather than toward Ada Bower's house, because that was where her book was, and they both seemed to understand that they wanted the remainder of the afternoon. It was on the walk back, halfway along the road between town and his ranch, that he reached over and took her hand simply, without preamble or ceremony, and she let him take it, and they walked the rest of the way like that, not speaking, with the snow-covered prairie on either side and the sky above them the particular shade of winter blue that felt, to Orville, like the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life, and simultaneously only the second most beautiful. And he was aware that this thought was not entirely rational, but that did not make it less true. She stayed for supper that evening, which she had not done before, and afterward they sat by the fire and she read to him from the Whitman, the lines about containing multitudes, which she read twice, looking up at him on the second reading, and then she closed the book and they sat in a silence that had become, over these months, so comfortable and so specific to them that it felt almost like a language they had built together. Then she said, "I should like to tell you something, and I want to say it properly." "All right," he said. "When I came here I was afraid," she said, "not of particular things. I was afraid in that total way where fear has become so constant you forget what it felt like not to have it." She looked at the fire. "In 4 months that has changed. I do not feel afraid when I am here. I feel," she paused, finding the word with care, "settled. And I want you to know that you have done that, not by doing anything dramatic, by being consistent, by being exactly who you appeared to be at the beginning." Orville looked at her, and the firelight was on her face, and her hair was half loose from its pins as it always was by evening, and he thought about all the things he wanted to say, and he chose the most accurate one. "Lenora," he said, "I would very much like to court you properly if that is something you would welcome, not to change anything about how we are already, but to say honestly that my intentions are not casual, that I have not once in these 4 months thought of you as someone passing through." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw the amber come up in her brown eyes. "I think," she said slowly, "that is exactly what I came in here to tell you I would welcome, if you asked it." He smiled, and it was the unguarded kind, the kind that only happens when you stop performing any version of yourself and simply feel something. "Then I am asking it," he said. "And I am accepting it," she said. They sat by the fire for another hour, and nothing changed and everything changed, and the snow fell softly outside and Tuesday shifted in her stall in the barn, and Sergeant breathed slowly on the rug at their feet and the wood stove ticked, and the world outside was cold and dark, and the world inside that room was the warmest it had ever been. Spring came to Kansas slowly, the way it always did, grudgingly withdrawing the cold by degrees, until the morning you looked out the window and the pasture was green, and the cottonwoods along the creek had put out their pale new leaves and the meadowlarks were back, singing their extravagant songs from the fence posts. Lenora saw the spring arrive from the window of her classroom, and from the window of Ada Bower's room on Elm Street, and on Fridays and Sundays. Sunday visits had been added to the calendar with a natural inevitability, from the window of Orville's sitting room. They had settled into courtship with the same ease they had settled into everything else, which was to say with directness and without artifice, two people who had both, in their different ways, used up their allotment of performance, and arrived at a preference for truth. He brought her flowers when they appeared prairie wildflowers, not arranged, just gathered from the pasture edge and presented matter-of-factly, which she received the same way, putting them in a glass of water as though they were exactly what they were and did not require commentary. She brought him bread she baked at Ada Bauer's kitchen on Saturday mornings, and books she thought he should read, flagging the pages she thought were important. He took her riding on Sundays when the weather allowed. He had a second horse, a buckskin gelding named Arthur, who was better mannered than Tuesday in close company, and Lenora rode with a confidence that told him she had grown up around horses despite the city she came from, and when he asked she told him that her father had kept horses in his better years, and that she had learned young and had not forgotten. They rode out across his land and the land beyond it, across the flat immensity of the Kansas plains, where the grass went on as far as the eye could travel, and the sky above was so large it made you understand the word horizon in a new way. He showed her where the creek turned south and the cottonwoods grew thickest, and where a sandstone outcropping rose from the prairie like the spine of something enormous, and where, in April, the first wildflowers came up in a strip of color along the south-facing slope. Standing at the sandstone outcropping one Sunday in late April, with Arthur and Tuesday grazing below and the warm spring wind moving over everything, Lenora turned and said, "Tell me something you have never told anyone." He considered. "I have been lonely," he said. "Not circumstantially, I mean constitutionally. I have been a man who has felt alone in his own life even when there were people around him. I did not know that had changed until one day I noticed I was not feeling it anymore, and I traced it back to approximately September of last year." She looked at him. "September. The end of September specifically," he said. "A porch, an empty house." The wind moved her hair across her face and she pushed it back with one hand and looked at him with that direct amber-brown gaze that he had by now completely given up defending himself against. "I have never been good at accepting help," she said. "I have always believed, perhaps too strongly, that to accept help was to become diminished in some way, to be in someone's debt." She paused. "I have been rethinking that." "Have you arrived at any conclusions?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I think the difference is between help that is given in order to create an obligation and help that is given because a person sees you and simply wants your circumstances to be better. The first kind diminishes you. The second kind does not." She looked at him steadily. "You have only ever given the second kind." He stepped toward her, because there was nothing else to do, and she did not step back, and he put his hands on her face very carefully, and kissed her for the first time in the warm spring air above the Kansas plain with the horses grazing below and the wildflowers on the hillside and the sky enormous and blue above them. It was a long, slow kiss, the kind that contains everything said and not said, and when it ended she kept her eyes closed for a moment, her hands holding the front of his coat, and then she opened her eyes and looked at him. "That," she said, with great composure and also very pink cheeks, "was well done." He laughed, and she laughed, and Arthur looked up from the grass with the mild interest of a horse who has no particular opinion about human behavior, and the spring afternoon unfolded around them in all its extravagant beauty. He asked her to marry him on a Wednesday in May, which was not a Friday or Sunday, and therefore unexpected, which he had calculated would be more likely to produce a true answer rather than a prepared one. He had ridden to town specifically on a Wednesday afternoon to find her at the end of the school day, and she came out of the schoolhouse with chalk on her hands and her hair, as usual by that time of day, making its characteristic escape from its pins, and she looked up and saw him standing by the fence post where he had tied Tuesday, and she stopped walking. He came to her. He did not get down on one knee, because the schoolyard was muddy from the previous night's rain, and also because he thought Lenora was not the kind of woman who needed or wanted the theatrical. But he took her hand and he looked at her and he said, "I love you, Lenora. I love who you are in your specific particular self, and I love who I am when I am with you, which is the better version of myself. I would like to spend my life with you, if you will let me. Not because you need somewhere to stay, though the room is yours for as long as you want it in any case, but because I cannot imagine the years going forward without you in them, and I find I have no interest in trying." She stood in the muddy schoolyard with chalk on her hands and looked at him for a moment that seemed very long, though he did not think it was, and then she said, "Yes, Orville, of course yes." He put his arms around her, and she put her chalk-dusted hands on his back and held on, and Mrs. Ruiz's granddaughter Paz, who had stayed late and was still visible through the schoolhouse window, told her grandmother about it that evening, and Mrs. Ruiz told him the next week that Paz's account included the detail that Miss Lockhart had appeared to be crying, which Lenora, when he mentioned this, denied entirely and very convincingly, except for the smile she could not fully suppress. They were married in June, at the Crestwood Church, which was a white clapboard building with a bell that rang on Sunday mornings, and could be heard all the way to the ranch if the wind was right. The ceremony was presided over by Reverend Marsh, who had a large white beard and a tendency toward lengthy sermons that he reined in on this occasion to a respectful 20 minutes. Mrs. Ruiz was there, and Ada Bauer and Gerald Fitch, who brought his wife, and Ed Carmichael and his 2 daughters, who threw flower petals with the commitment of people performing an important scientific experiment. Sheriff Lester Hodge was there, a quiet man in his 40s whom Orville had known for 7 years, and he shook Orville's hand afterward with the expression of someone who had been waiting to do this for a while. Lenora wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the preceding weeks, working in Ada Bauer's sitting room on Saturday evenings, which she had not allowed Orville to see before the day of the wedding, and when he saw her at the front of the church, he stood very still for a moment because she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and the accuracy of that thought was a physical sensation. At the small reception afterward in the church hall, where Mrs. Ruiz and Ada Bauer had together produced a quantity of food that required no explanation for why either woman was formidable, Lenora came to stand beside him and slid her hand into his with the proprietary ease of someone who has decided entirely where she belongs, and he closed his hand around hers and thought, "Here. This is where everything that was missing has arrived." They went home to the ranch that evening in the wagon under the summer stars, and Sargent came out to greet them and seemed to find nothing unusual about the situation, which Orville thought was the correct attitude. The summer was the best one of Orville's life. He knew it at the time, which is a rare knowledge, because usually the best times are best understood afterward in retrospect, but he knew it while it was happening, and the knowing of it made him careful with each day, careful in the sense of giving each one his full attention. Lenora taught the summer term at the school, which Fitch had organized for the children who needed additional instruction, and she gardened in the mornings before school and in the evenings when she came home, expanding the vegetable plot on the south side of the house from his surviving turnips and onions into something that produced tomatoes and green beans and squash, and an ill-advised but ultimately triumphant row of corn. She also planted flowers along the porch, not for any practical reason, simply because she wanted them there, and he found he agreed with this decision entirely. In the evenings they sat on their own porch, the porch of the ranch house that was now genuinely and specifically theirs, and the summer air came in off the prairie and Lenora read or wrote letters. She had re-established contact with her cousin Benjamin in Wichita, who turned out to have received her July letter and had been wondering what had happened to her, and Orville worked at practical things with his hands. Mending leather or sharpening tools or simply sitting with his coffee and watching the light change across the prairie, which was a thing he had done alone for many years and which was now transformed by company. They talked on those evenings. Not always about consequential things, sometimes about the children in her classroom, whose specific personalities she described with the sharp, affectionate clarity of someone who has paid close attention. Sometimes about the ranch, about his plans for the following season, about whether to expand the cattle operation or put more of the land into winter wheat. Sometimes about books. Sometimes about their childhoods, laid out in pieces over many evenings, each piece placed down like a card in a game that was not competitive and had no stakes beyond knowing each other completely. He learned that she had wanted, at various points in her life, to be a botanist and also a lawyer, and also to sail on a ship to somewhere entirely different from Indiana or Missouri or Kansas, none of which had materialized, and she spoke of these not materializations without self-pity, with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has made her peace with the shape her life has actually taken, and finds it, on balance, good. He told her about the cattle drives, about the Kisham Trail in 1872 and 1873, the long months moving cattle north through Indian Territory, through land that had been systematically cleared of the people who had lived on it for generations. And he spoke about this with a directness that surprised her, the awareness he carried, the discomfort of his own participation in a system he had not thought carefully enough about until later. He had known some of the men who did the clearing. He had eaten their cattle and ridden their trail and benefited from arrangements that were unjust, and he named this plainly rather than finding the language that would clean it up. She listened to this with the focused gravity she brought to important things. "It is good," she said carefully, "that you know it and say it plainly. It does not undo it, but the knowing matters." "I know," he said. "I know the knowing doesn't fix it. I think about that." "So do I," she said, "about other things. The world makes its arrangements, and the arrangements are frequently wrong, and some of us benefit from them without choosing to, and the question is what you do with knowing that." She was quiet for a moment. "I think you keep seeing it clearly and you keep trying to do differently when you can. It is not a satisfying answer." "No," he agreed, "but I think it is the honest one." In September, Lenora told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with the directness and without embellishment that were her characteristic way of delivering information that was significant. She watched his face. He sat with it for a moment, the information, the enormous fact of it, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings. Ada Bauer says that passes." He came around the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, which made her laugh, and put her hands on his wrists. "Orville," she said, "you look as though you might cry." "I might," he said honestly. "I reserve the right." She turned her face into his hand for a moment, just briefly, a gesture so unguarded it caught him entirely off guard, and then she straightened up and said briskly, "I intend to keep teaching until December at the least. I will require the school board's acknowledgement that a woman in my condition is not a subject for public commentary. I suspect Gerald Fitch will be awkward about it." "Gerald Fitch," Orville said, "will manage, because you will tell him exactly what is expected of him and he will do it." "That is my assessment as well," she said, and reached for her coffee. "The school board did manage." Lenora taught through November, growing more visibly pregnant and less interested in anyone's opinion about it, maintaining order in her classroom with the same combination of genuine interest and serene expectation of cooperation that had worked from the beginning. The children were, Mrs. Ruiz reported, magnificently matter-of-fact about the whole thing in the way that children often are. Paz asked Lenora where babies came from, in front of the entire class, and Lenora gave a factual and age-appropriate answer that Paz reported to her grandmother verbatim, causing Mrs. Ruiz to say simply, "Good." In January of 1880, in the middle of a snowstorm that came down from the north with the intention of making itself remembered, Lenora gave birth to a son in the bedroom of the ranch house, with the assistance of the midwife from Crestwood, a steady, competent woman named Clara, who had attended more than 40 births in the county and who told Lenora, when she expressed what was a very controlled version of fear, that she was stronger than any woman she had delivered, and Clara had been doing this work since 1861. It was a long, hard night, and Orville spent most of it in the hall outside the bedroom door because that was where Clara told him to be, and he sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his hands wrapped around his knees like a man bracing against a wind, and Sargent sat next to him in perfect solidarity, and some time before dawn a child made his entrance into the world and announced it clearly. Clara opened the door. "You have a son," she said. "Mother and child are both well." Orville stood up and went in, and Lenora was in the bed, pale and exhausted and more completely present than he had ever seen anyone, holding a small red-faced person wrapped in the quilt his mother had made, and she looked up at him with eyes that were tired and brilliant and said, "Come and meet your son, Orville." He sat on the edge of the bed and she held out the bundle, and he took his son in his arms for the first time, and the boy opened his eyes, dark and unfocused as a new thing's eyes are, and Orville Doyle, who had held himself together through 31 years of life with the careful discipline of a man who does not think feelings are improved by display, was undone entirely, quietly and completely. "Hello," he said to his son very softly. "I am very glad you are here." Lenora put her head back against the pillow and watched him, and her face was a thing he would carry with him for the rest of his life. They named the boy James, after Lenora's father, who had been charming and reckless and brilliant, and who had loved his daughter in his complicated way. And the name acknowledged all of that, the love and the complication together, which was the truest kind of honoring. James Doyle grew up on the ranch outside of Crestwood, Kansas, with the prairie his backyard and his mother's books his inheritance, and his father's steady hands teaching him the language of horses and land and hard, honest work. He was, from the beginning, a child with his mother's direct brown eyes and his father's careful, deliberate way of thinking. And he was curious about everything in the way that children are when they are raised by people who consider curiosity a virtue. By the spring of 1881, James was 14 months old and walking with the fierce determination of a person who has places to be, and Lenora had returned to teaching that fall, bringing him to school with her those first months, where he sat in a small wooden chair that Orville made and stared at the older children with the concentrated attention of someone taking notes, and the older children were rendered entirely incapable of misbehaving in the presence of a small person so clearly judging them. The ranch had grown, not dramatically, but consistently, in the way of things that are tended carefully. Orville had added 12 head of cattle in the spring of 1880, and the winter wheat field that he had put in experimentally in 1879 had returned well enough to make it a reliable feature. He had repaired the barn roof, rebuilt the south fence entirely, and begun work on an addition to the house, a second bedroom that James would eventually need his own, and that Lenora had proposed should also include a proper bookshelf built into the wall, which Orville had agreed to with the seriousness it deserved. Mrs. Ruiz came now 4 mornings a week rather than 3, because there was more to help with, and because she had developed an attachment to James that she described as professional interest in child development, and which everyone recognized as grandmother-level love. Paz came with her on Saturdays sometimes, now 11 years old, and Lenora had been quietly tutoring her on reading and mathematics in sessions that were more rigorous than the school curriculum, and that Paz pursued with the same fierce application she brought to everything. Lenora's cousin Benjamin had visited in the summer of 1880, driving up from Wichita in his wagon with his wife Cora and their 3 children, a man of 32 who looked nothing like Lenora and shared very little with her temperamentally, but who was clearly and genuinely glad to find her so well, and who shook Orville's hand with the particular intensity of a man expressing gratitude for something he cannot quite put into words. They stayed a week, and Benjamin and Orville found each other's company agreeable in the direct, uncomplicated way of men who are not trying to impress each other. And Lenora and Cora discovered a shared taste for a particular kind of domestic frankness, and sat on the porch in the evenings talking while the children ran in the pasture, and the men sat on the other end of the porch talking about cattle prices and the railroad expansion. When Benjamin's family left to drive back to Wichita, Lenora stood at the gate and watched the wagon go down the road until she could no longer see it, and then she turned back to the house and Orville was standing at the porch railing and he said nothing, only offered his hand, and she came up the path and took it. "Family," she said reflectively, not unhappily. "Yes," he agreed. "It is strange to have it back," she said. "In parts." "Strange and good," he offered. "Strange and very good," she said, and went inside to where James was sitting on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and a pot lid, which were apparently the most fascinating objects currently available. In the fall of 1881, Harlan Dutton made his last appearance as an antagonist, arriving at the school board meeting in October with a new set of objections that most of the board found more tiresome than substantive. Lenora was there, as she was for every school board meeting now as a matter of established practice, not because anyone had asked her to attend, but because she had decided that her classroom was her domain and its governance was her concern, and she attended with the same composed inevitability with which she did everything. She addressed Dutton's objections item by item with the patience of someone who has explained something before and is doing so again for the last time. Fitch, by now thoroughly accustomed to Lenora's manner and privately admiring of it, upheld her position on every point. Dutton left the meeting early, and he did not return to it the following quarter or the one after that. He was not present, and probably did not notice, when the Crestwood School Board voted in the spring of 1882 to name Lenora Lockhart Doyle as the first head teacher of the consolidated Crestwood area school, a new position that acknowledged the expansion of the school population and came with a modest additional salary. Gerald Fitch delivered this news at the April meeting with the manner of a man who has been waiting to do something right for quite some time, and Lenora accepted it with a nod and a thank you that contained multitudes. She told Orville about it when she came home that evening. He was in the barn when she arrived, working on a bridle, and she came in and leaned against the stall partition and told him flatly, without performance, and he set down the bridle and looked at her. "Head teacher," he said. "Yes." "Well deserved," he said. "Yes," she said, without false modesty, because she agreed because it was true. He crossed the small distance of the stall and kissed her, slowly and deliberately, the way he had gotten better at over these years, and she kissed him back with equal deliberateness, and Arthur the gelding regarded them from the adjacent stall with his customary mild opinion, and Tuesday shifted in her straw. "I thought," Lenora said, against his shoulder, because she had not stepped back yet and neither had he, "that I might plant roses along the east side of the porch this spring. I have been thinking about it since February." "Then we will plant roses," he said. In the summer of 1882, Lenora told him she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening on the porch, with James asleep inside and the prairie fireflies coming up in the dusk and a whippoorwill doing its relentless business somewhere in the cottonwoods. He took her hand. He held it. He said, "Are you pleased?" "I am," she said. And then, with the dry affection that was so distinctly her own, James could do with the company. "He has been talking to Sargent as though they have serious business to transact, and I think it would benefit him to have an interlocutor closer to his own species." James was by then 2.5 years old, and his serious business with Sargent was indeed an ongoing concern, conducted in a mixture of words and gestures that Sargent appeared to follow with complete comprehension. The second child arrived in February of 1883, a girl this time, delivered in the same bedroom by the same midwife Clara, who reported with satisfaction that Lenora was even better at this than she had been the first time, which Lenora received as the high professional compliment it was intended to be. They named her Margaret after Orville's mother, and she was from the beginning a person of strong opinions expressed at high volume, which James found fascinating and Sargent found bewildering, and both of her parents found entirely correct. Orville held Margaret for the first time, and she stopped crying and looked at him with the absolute present-focused attention of a new infant, and he thought, and here you are. Here is more. James met his sister with the solemnity of someone receiving a significant delivery. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he announced, "She is small," with the tone of a man noting a feature that will require accommodation. "She will grow," Lenora said. "I know," James said, still regarding his sister carefully. "Like everything does." Orville looked at Lenora over the top of James's head, and the smile they exchanged was of the private, layered kind that belongs to people who have built something together and know the full depth of what they have built. The years found their shape. Orville's ranch continued to grow steadily, not dramatically, which was the right pace for the land and for him. He was known in Crestwood and the surrounding county as a man whose word meant what he said it meant, whose fences were sound, whose cattle were well kept, whose handshake closed a deal. He was also known as Lenora Doyle's husband, which he considered in some ways the better of his reputations, and which he wore without any feeling of diminishment, because he was a man who understood what he had. Lenora's school grew. By 1884, it had 23 students, and by 1886 it had 31, necessitating a second teacher, a young woman named Harriet Webb from Lawrence, whom Lenora mentored with the same clear-eyed practical generosity that characterized everything she did. Harriet said, in a letter to her mother that was later shared with Lenora, that Miss Lockhart, she called her Miss Lockhart in the letter, because the formal address felt appropriate for a woman of such presence, was the finest teacher she had ever observed, and that she had learned more in 6 months of working alongside her than in 3 years of normal school. Lenora read this letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and said, "That is very kind," in the voice of a woman who is pleased and does not intend to make a production of it. Sheriff Lester Hodge retired in 1884 and was replaced by a younger man named Cal Perry, who wore a star with the uncomfortable awareness of someone learning a very specific kind of responsibility. Orville served briefly on the Citizens Committee that oversaw the transition, because Hodge asked him to, and he did it, and it was useful, and then it was done. Mrs. Ruiz's granddaughter Paz, by 1885, had grown into a woman of 16, who was the most academically accomplished student Lenora had taught in 7 years of teaching, and who had expressed a clear ambition to become a teacher herself. And Lenora had written letters to the normal school in Emporia, Kansas, on her behalf, letters that were thorough and precise, and made the kind of case that does not leave room for refusal, and Paz was accepted. Mrs. Ruiz received this news with the equanimity of someone who had known it was coming and had been waiting for the world to catch up, and she said to Lenora simply, "I knew she would go somewhere worth going when you started with her." "She did all of it herself," Lenora said. "She had someone who saw what she was capable of," Mrs. Ruiz said. "That is also not nothing." On a Friday evening in October of 1885, Orville came home to find Lenora on the porch. She was sitting in the chair she preferred, the one with the wide arms, where she liked to set her coffee cup, and she had a book open in her lap. James, 7 years old now, was in the yard doing something complicated with a piece of rope and a fence post. Margaret, 2½, was sitting on the porch steps sorting pebbles by a system that she apparently found self-evident. Orville rode Tuesday through the gate and dismounted, and he led Tuesday toward the barn, and Sergeant came to meet him. And Orville paused and looked at the porch, at Lenora reading in the autumn light, at James's rope project, at Margaret's pebble taxonomy, at the roses he had planted along the east side of the porch in 1882 that had come back every year and were now a proper fixture, brown and thick-stemmed, with the last of the season's blooms going dry in the October air. Lenora looked up. She saw him standing there, Tuesday's reins in his hand and Sergeant at his knee, and she read whatever was on his face with the accuracy she had developed over 7 years of reading him, and she said, "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She looked at him steadily, that direct amber-brown gaze that had not changed in anything that mattered. "Good-looking?" she asked. It was the kind of question that in her voice was not quite teasing and not quite serious, occupying the space between them where their humor lived. "The best kind," he said. He put Tuesday up and came back and sat in his own chair beside her on the porch, and Margaret immediately abandoned her pebble project and climbed onto his lap with the confidence of someone who has never been refused this. And James looked up from his rope to register his father's presence, and then returned to the problem at hand, and Lenora turned a page. The afternoon light was the color it got in October, the slanted amber light that made everything look as though it was lit from within, and the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow, and the grass was tawny, and the sky above the flat horizon was the vast and particular blue of the Great Plains fall. Orville held his daughter and watched his wife read, and listened to his son's quiet commentary to himself about the rope project. And the prairie was wide, and the season was turning, and the world was imperfect and unjust in ways that he thought about and that he tried, in his particular daily practice, to address where he could address them and to name where he could name them. And alongside all of this, in the same moment, continuously and without qualification, the life on this porch was the best one he could have imagined. Lenora turned another page and then said, without looking up, "There is venison stew on the stove. Mrs. Ruiz left it this morning." "I smelled it when I rode in," he said. "James," she said, "the rope project will still be there after supper." "I know," James said, "but I am very close." "You have 10 minutes," she said, with the tone she used in her classroom, the one that was not unkind but was definitive, and James counted to himself quietly and began negotiating with the rope more urgently. Margaret turned her face up to Orville's and said with great seriousness, "Papa, I have a pebble." "I see that," he said, equally seriously. "That is a very good one." She examined it again, satisfied that her assessment had been corroborated. Lenora set her book face down on her knee, marking her place, and looked out at the prairie in the late light, and he watched her, and she felt him watching, and she turned and looked at him. 7 years from the night he had found her on the porch of an empty house, and she still looked at him like that, straight and clear, and with something behind the amber brown that was specific to him, that he knew was for him alone, that had the quality of home in it, of land that knows you, of a door that opens before you've knocked. "What?" she said, the ghost of a smile. "The best kind of looking," he said again. She turned back to the prairie, and the last of the autumn sun came across her face, and he thought, Here is where the empty house became full. Here is where the woman who could not get up from a chair found herself standing in a life. Here is where I stopped being a man who was alone in his own life, and became someone whose life had arrived at him in the shape of a woman, with a book she was not reading and ink-stained hands, and a composure that was holding something enormous, and who had let him, in the end, be the person who stayed. He would not trade this life for any other version of himself. He knew that with the certainty of a man who has thought about it clearly and arrived at the only honest answer. The stew was on the stove. The boy had a rope to master. The girl had important pebbles. The roses would come back in the spring. The school would open Monday morning, and 23 children would arrive and find their teacher at the front of the room, chalk-dusted and present, giving each of them her full attention as though they were the most interesting person she had spoken to that day, because she meant it. And in the evening, as the prairie dark came in and the stars came out one at a time over Kansas, they would sit on their porch, the one with roses and a split-seated chair long since replaced, and a dog who snored on the step, and the world would be exactly what it was, which was imperfect and large and continuing, and they would be in it together, which was all either of them had ever truly needed. James solved the rope problem 8 minutes into his 10 and announced this to the prairie at large, and the prairie did not respond, but his mother looked up from her book and said, "Well done," which was better. The venison stew was excellent. They ate it at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, and the night coming down outside the windows and James telling them about a book he was reading about rivers and Margaret banging her spoon on the table in what appeared to be a rhythmic commentary. And Orville watched his family in the lamplight and held the moment the way his mother had taught him, the way she used to say, "Hold the good ones, son. Hold them while they are happening, not only after they are gone." He held it. Outside, the stars came out over the Kansas plain, and the coyotes started their old lonesome song, and the cottonwoods along the creek whispered their dry autumn language. And in the warm yellow light of the kitchen window of a ranch house 4 miles east of Crestwood, a family ate their supper and the night was wide and gentle around them. And everything that had been lost had led to this. And everything that was found was real. And the empty house was empty no longer.